Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, keep your phones off, then if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during or after her presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming dear Professor Laura Bhaskar. Laura is an associate professor of accounting at the Indiana University. Laura earned her PhD in accounting from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Laura specialized in behavioral auditing research and focused on topics such as audit quality, audit regulations, and internal control audits. Her research has been published in top-ranking journals such as the Journal of Accounting Research, the Accounting Review, Contemporary Accounting Research, and Auditing, a Journal of Practice and Theory, and Accounting Horizon. She currently serves on the editorial board of at Accounting Organization and Society and Auditing, a Journal of Practice and Theory. Now we will start our seminar with dear Professor Laura.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Share my screen here. Does that look good? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here. I'm delighted to present with you all. It's just wonderful that we can get this academic community together and share our work and learn from each other. And so thank you so much for that invite. I chose this paper one because I love this paper and I'm excited to present it. But I feel like it really kind of captures the essence of me as a researcher. And so I'm really excited to kind of share this work with you all. A couple of things about it. Like one, it tackles an important audit issue in practice. And so we're looking at how depletion influences auditors' behavior, something that we feel like is really important to auditors in practice now. And we'll talk about that. It also uses psychology theory to really understand how individuals make judgments and decisions. And that's something that I'm really interested in. And finally, we use the experimental economics method for our experiment, which I think is a really powerful method. It is what I was trained at Georgia Tech. All the faculty use that method there. And it's widely used in managerial accounting literature, but less so in auditing. And so I think it'll be really fun to kind of share that method and talk about that. And I think it's a powerful way to test certain research questions that are difficult to test with auditors in practice. And so we'll talk about that. So this paper, how does depletion affect auditor negotiations? The importance of a skeptic or client service natural disposition. This is co-authored with my two wonderful co-authors, Tracy Majors from USC. She's on the call, and Adam Vitalis at Waterloo. He is also here. So I'm delighted that they can be here as well. We have been working on this paper for a while, but we just went through like a major revision. And so we collected some additional qualitative data to kind of support our experimental findings. And so we're really excited to share this new version of the paper. So what do we do in this paper? Kind of looking at our motivation and research questions. We're looking at the negotiation setting. Negotiations are used to resolve differences between managers and auditors, and they're really critical for financial reporting quality. These are when they're resolving complex issues related to estimates where there may be differences in opinions, and that's what's ultimately going to impact the audited financial reports. And so we think that negotiations are just kind of a critical area to study. We were interested in this paper. Kind of started with our interest in depletion, and we thought depletion can be really critical for the year-end audit when these negotiations take place. So we know that, during the year-end where negotiations happen, it's a busy time. There's a lot of deadline pressure. Auditors are managing multiple clients. They're kind of constantly engaged in complex thinking. All of these things kind of lead to a depleting environment that auditors are working in during that time when these negotiations exist. And prior research, I'll talk about depletion more in a few minutes, but if you're not familiar with the term, you can think of it kind of as like a cognitive fatigue, or just kind of not to the extent of burnout, but more just feeling cognitively kind of exhausted, like when you have these busy times. And so prior research in auditing finds that depletion can impair auditors' judgments. But we think that this will really depend in the negotiation setting, it'll depend on the auditor's natural dispositions, how depletion influences the auditor's negotiations. And so our main research questions is, how does depletion affect auditor behavior during client negotiations? And how do these depletion effects vary based on auditors' skeptical dispositions? And so I'm going to go through one more slide here on the summary of our findings, and then I'd love to open it up to questions, to get any questions as we go along. So in terms of our summary of findings, as I mentioned, we do an experimental economics abstract experiment where we mimic the real world incentives for managers and auditors in a back and forth setting with students acting in the auditor and manager roles. And so we put in all of their incentives. So the auditors have these competing incentives where they want to make sure that there's not a lot of bias in managers' reported estimates. So they have those professional responsibilities. We'll talk a little bit more about the incentives later. But they also have incentives to, pragmatic incentives, client considerations. They want to keep the client happy, ultimately come to agreement with the client on what that estimate is. And so we think our theory predicts that when they're not depleted, they'll be able to balance those incentives. So you can see here that we don't find a difference between the client service auditors and the skeptics. You can think of client service auditors as like the low skeptics, and we'll talk about that more. So there is no difference. They're able to manage those competing incentives under non-depleting conditions, but depletion, it decreases the auditor's challenging behaviors for client service auditors. And we expect that's because those challenging behaviors are difficult. They're kind of effortful for auditors who are more naturally client service oriented and less skeptical. And then depletion, we find increases, this is consistent with our predictions, for the skeptical auditors, because we think that the skeptical auditors find those challenging behaviors natural. By definition, they are skeptical, they like digging in, they like challenging, they like engaging in those behaviors. And then they're probably not engaging in the effortful client service, pragmatic incentives that they have. And so we can see these very diverging effects of depletion on auditors during negotiation. And so that's a summary of our main experiment. And then we do some supplemental qualitative data with auditors. So the experiment provides really strong internal validity. We know that we've manipulated depletion and we've measured their skeptical dispositions, but those are done in a kind of an abstract task, an abstract way. And so we conduct additional qualitative data with practicing auditors to, one, first just better understand what depletion looks like in the audit environment, and to make sure that they do have, these triggers of depletion and what those look like. And then two, we validate the realism of our skeptic versus client service auditor disposition. So we talk with audit partners in interviews, and then we collect data with audit managers and partners later. And we kind of validate this measure that we use for these high and low skeptics, these skeptical and client service auditors. And so it provides like a really nice complement of each other, adding value or adding a lot on our independent measures that we use in the study. So any questions there before I move on? I'm happy to, if at any point you have questions, feel free to jump in and ask at this point. Okay, so if you're not too familiar with depletion, I just kind of want to first go through like, what is depletion? We're talking here about self-regulatory depletion. You can think of this as self-control. So the psychology literature has been studying this for a very long time. And by definition, it's kind of this phenomenon that after exerting self-regulation, after exerting self-control, people are less willing to exercise further self-regulation. Self-regulation often also referred to as self-control. It's this process by which the self changes its thoughts, feelings, and actions. And so a couple of, kind of triggers from psychology, these things that are effortful that require self-regulation are things like complex thinking, inhibiting impulses, making a lot of choices, resisting temptations, suppressing emotions or thoughts. Like all of these require a lot of self-regulation. And that is effortful for, many people. And then the effects of that in the psychology literature is that after you use that self-regulation for these actions, you're less willing to engage in future actions that require self-regulation, and kind of think that this is being like cognitively tired. Okay, so you're going to be less willing to put in that effort on this self-regulation in the future. So some of the classic examples from psychology, the first here is this cookie and radishes experiment. So it was that if in a lab experiment, individuals were brought in and there were radishes and cookies, and they were told, one group was told they could eat the radishes and not the cookies. So they were resisting temptation to eat those cookies. And that, required a lot of self-regulation. And then on the subsequent task, they gave up earlier on these unsolvable puzzles. They were less willing to engage in those thoughtful exercises. Same as compared to the ones who were able to eat the cookies because they weren't resisting temptation. And same for the white bear. This is one of the other classic depletion examples. When people were talking, they were told not to think of a white bear. And that's really hard to do. Like you're suppressing these thoughts. When somebody kind of brings it up, then it's hard not to think about it. And so that, has effects on their subsequent self-regulation. And so we think that these triggers from psychology are probably really strong in auditing. Like as a prior auditor, I know that I was depleted a lot. It varied throughout my time in auditing, but especially in busy season, I feel like I would even start the day depleted sometimes. And Patrick Hurley has a paper on that auditors from practice do feel like depletion exists, and that in the busier season that they kind of start that day cognitively tired, like depleted. And so we think this has very interesting implications for auditing. We'd like to study it further. A little bit of background on auditor negotiations, because, the setting we're looking at, auditors and clients have, really different views due to their incentives. And so with negotiations, we know that managers have a lot of incentives to report biased within reason. So, there's a lot of discretion in how they report estimates, and that provides a lot of opportunity for them to be opportunistic, like whether that's just because their optimism influences them or they're trying to be aggressive to reach targets. We know from a rich literature in financial reporting that there's a lot of bias in GAAP reporting given this discretion. So they have, and we capture these incentives in our experiment. So managers have incentives to report biased, but within reason. So in our study, in our experiment, just like the real world, there are some consequences of being too biased. So if the managers in our experiment report too much bias, it could end in an impasse, like not reaching agreement with the auditor, and then they receive zero compensation for that round. And then we know in the real world, like for negotiations, auditors have these kind of complicated balanced competing incentives. So they have incentives to challenge managers' bias. They want to make sure they're reducing that bias and kind of limit the risk of a material misstatement. So they have a lot of professional responsibilities. They have inspection risk, internal risk. If there is a material misstatement, they'll suffer potential litigation costs or reputational concerns. So, they have a strong incentives to make sure that the bias is reduced to an acceptable level. They also have incentives to, like, pragmatic incentives. Like they are in a client service business. They want to keep the client happy. They don't want to unnecessarily, upset them. There are a lot of efficiency incentives. The longer you go with negotiations, that can take time and costs, and they ultimately do want to be able to release these financial reports in a timely manner. And so they're also needing to think and balance these pragmatic incentives as well. And so we kind of think about this and build theory that auditors likely find these challenging behaviors or pragmatic behaviors more or less natural and more or less effortful based on their skeptical dispositions. So we'll kind of talk about that theory a little bit more, but we think that high skeptic auditors probably find the challenging behaviors fairly natural and not very effortful, whereas the less skeptic auditors, those client service auditors, they'll probably find challenging managers to be a lot more effortful. We think they'll be willing to do it, it's their responsibility, but when they're depleted, it'll be more difficult for them to do that. And so we think that their natural dispositions of skepticism will really influence and moderate how they behave when they're depleted. So a little more on the skeptical dispositions. There is a rich literature here on trait skepticism. That's what we're looking at. And so we know that trait skeptics from the Nolder and Caduce work and the Hurt papers, that skeptics kind of have this natural questioning mind, and they're able to kind of suspend judgment, make sure they get in all the evidence before making like a quick judgment. They have this search for knowledge. They kind of leave no stone unturned. They really want to dig in and get to the right answer. And they exhibit these skeptical behaviors. So there are several studies that link auditors' trait skepticism with their actions and how their behaviors kind of reflect those skeptical behaviors. And so we think that high skeptics, this aligns with those challenging behaviors that are required during auditor negotiations. And so we think that for high skeptics, these challenging behaviors will be kind of natural. And then these behaviors that are kind of at odds with those pragmatic behaviors, like the client concerns and those incentives for like efficient closure and things like that, because they want to get to the right answer. And then all of the prior, or most of the prior research that looks at skeptical dispositions like trait skepticism, it kind of tells you what the high skeptics are, but there's really not a lot of information on understanding what the low end of that scale is. And so, we kind of develop and dig in deep to what are those individuals that are low on this trait skeptic scale. We dug in and we thought like, so they're more focused on seeing if there's sufficient evidence to support the manager's estimates. They're a little quicker to accept the client's perspective. They're a little more trusting and think about the client. They also have kind of lower information search, more balanced information search. And so I don't think it's necessarily that they're like super low skeptic, but we talked with audit partners to kind of think about what these auditor types are. And they really align with these pragmatic behaviors. So related to managing client relationships and making sure that they have efficient closure and timely audits. And so we think that the low end of these skeptics, which we define as client service auditors after talking to some audit partners as we were developing this piece of the low skeptic. So we think that kind of aligns with pragmatic behaviors, but it's very much at odds with the challenging behaviors. So we think that the client service auditors will find those pragmatic behaviors more natural and less effortful, and vice versa for the challenging behaviors. Any questions so far? I'm not monitoring the chat, so I trust someone else is doing that for me. Okay. So our theoretical development, now that we've kind of gone through the background, using our psychology theory. So psychology studies find that behaviors align with incentives when individuals are not depleted, but shift toward these less effortful actions when depleted. So if a motivated behavior, like let's say there's incentives in place, if that motivated behavior requires a lot of effort, then when they're depleted, because it requires so much self-regulation, they'll probably be less willing to engage in that when they're depleted. And likewise, if the motivated behavior requires little effort, then depletion has less of an effect. They might even engage in more of it if they were inhibiting themselves when they were not depleted. So I think this is a really nice example of our theory. This is a paper from Psychology. And in the experiment, all participants were hungry. So their motivated behavior is they're hungry, they want to eat. Question first. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about whether you distinguish between the type of skeptics. Like I'm thinking about this paper of Nelson that makes a distinction between whether people think skeptically or act skeptically. So I'm wondering, with the depletion, are you then like, is it for both that you would, if you're depleted for thinking, you would automatically act also, or how do you see that?
Yeah, we focus on the mindset to start. So when we're categorizing that high skeptic versus client service auditor, we're thinking about their natural mindset. So kind of where they are just from a trait, skeptical disposition, and then whether or not they engage in those actions that are skeptical or not. We think that very much depends on depletion. So
Okay.
So if the action is effortful for them, like challenging for client service auditors, challenging managers, we think that, depletion will reduce that action, that skeptical action. But for high skeptics, challenging is kind of what is natural to them in their mindset. And so we think that depletion will have less an effect or even do more if they're then doing less of the pragmatic behaviors.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Great question. So back to this example, so the motivated behavior here, they're all hungry. So they probably want to eat these peanuts. So they find here that when the motive behavior is effortless, let's say the peanuts are shelled, depletion increases that behavior because they're no longer kind of holding themselves back to maybe not eat too much. So you can see the light lines, the no shells, the dark lines here. Neutral is when they're not depleted. They kind of eat the same amount of peanuts. They're willing to put an effort to shell the peanuts if they're hungry, but not eat too many because they have that self-control. But when they're depleted, those without shells, the motivated behavior is less effortful. They eat a lot more peanuts. So they're no longer kind of inhibiting themselves to overeat. And then when the motivated behavior is effortful, so these peanuts are shelled, then you can see here that when they're not depleted, they're eating the peanuts, they're willing to shell them effortfully. But when they're depleted, they eat a lot less because they kind of become more passive. They're not really willing to put in that effort to eat the peanuts. Okay. And so that really relates to the theory that we're thinking of here with auditors. So we have the two types. We'll talk about the client service auditors first. We think that not depleted, they will be willing to engage in the behaviors they're supposed to. So they will be challenging to managers' bias, even though it's effortful. And of course, they'll also balance that with their pragmatic incentives that are natural to them. But when they're depleted, we think the client service auditors will kind of default more to their natural dispositions of being pragmatic, and they will be less willing to put in that effort to challenge managers' bias. Okay. And then on the other hand, for skeptical auditors, when they're not depleted, we think, again, they will effortfully engage in all behaviors that they need to for negotiations. Like they will engage in those pragmatic behaviors of thinking about the client, taking their perspective, trying to be efficient, reach closure. But when they're depleted, they will tilt more toward their natural behaviors of challenging and be less willing to put in that effort on those pragmatic behaviors. And so this leads to these divergent predictions on the effects of depletion, our H1A, is that the client service auditors will challenge managers down from their initial biased positions to a lesser extent when depleted versus not depleted. So it will reduce the client, depletion will reduce the client service auditors' challenging behaviors in negotiations. Whereas H1B for skeptical auditors, we think that they will challenge to a greater extent when they're depleted, because they will be engaging in those pragmatic considerations to a lesser extent. Okay, any questions there? So how do we test our predictions? Our main study is our experiment. Again, we use the experimental economics method, and we test this with 206 accounting undergraduates in an abstract incentivized experiment. The reason we chose this method is because we really need to test this research question back and forth negotiations, where managers and auditors are going back and forth, trying with their incentives that are in the real world, trying to reach agreement. And we want to see how depletion influences the auditors. And so it's really hard to do that study with practicing managers and auditors. It also provides us an opportunity to very cleanly manipulate depletion and test those effects. And so it's a great method to use for a study like this. So we use this abstract experiment with incentives that mimic the real world, following many prior studies. One of the classic ones cited here is Ketchel-Meyer and King. And we hold those incentives constant across all conditions. So across all of our conditions, depletion, non-depletion, and whether they're high or low skeptics, that's not going to influence any of our predictions. All the economic incentives are held constant across conditions. In terms of the incentives, the reporters, their payoff, so they get real incentives in the study. The average pay was around $22, and they could make, some people made 10, some people made up to 34. So it's a pretty big variation dependent on their decisions. So they are incentivized. So the reporters are the managers. We avoid using the word manager to kind of avoid some other effects that come with that. So it's, again, this abstract setting. So the reporters are the managers. Their payoff increases with accepted values. So they have incentive. They're going to receive whatever the accepted value is, but they will also earn 0 if they can't come to agreement with the auditor. So they have strong incentives to report biased. They're given asset values. I'll come back to that in a minute. So they have strong incentives to report upwardly biased, but within reason, because they do need to come to agreement with the auditor. The verifiers are the auditors, so they're assigned to that role, and they receive a fixed wage. So again, all these are trying to mimic the real world, the fixed wage for doing the audit. And then they also have a risk of penalty if the final accepted value in the negotiation is higher than the true value of the asset. And then they also have a small cost per round, because kind of going back and forth with the managers is costly. You're kind of incurring that client reputational cost as negotiations prolong. And then they also receive the 0 if there's an impasse, if they don't come to agreement over the 10 rounds of negotiation. So this is a negotiation task. We adapt it from a prior study by Church et al. We do adapt it a little bit. And so over 10 independent periods, so they're randomly repaired, the managers and auditors over 10 periods, and they negotiate over these asset values. The managers get private information. So they all know common information that the asset value can range from, I think it's 50 to 500. But the managers have private information just like the real world. So they get a smaller range of where they know the true value is, but it's private information and they don't know for sure. There's still discretion and uncertainty over what that asset value will be. So the reporters give the first offer, the verifiers counter offer, and they go back and forth up to 10 rounds And, they're trying not to end in an impasse. I think are there some questions here? No? Okay.
Oh, Isaac just brought up a question in the chat, so I addressed it. It was a really, really insightful question about depletion and if it's a function of task complexity, high stakes tasks, or task load. And so I just shared, like, you can comment on it too, but I just shared that we've seen evidence of all three in the interviews and psych theory. But
Yeah.
that was mine. Yeah.
Okay, great. Did you have any follow-up questions, Isaac, or was that good? Okay. Yeah, so they are negotiating over these asset values and trying to come to an agreement. Okay. I probably won't go into the parameters too much. The key things here are just that it is a random draw of the asset values. The reporter has the private information. And then the payoffs we went through. So auditors, the verifiers have to kind of balance those two incentives, the pragmatic client consideration incentives. And, they don't want high aggressive reporting, high biased reporting, because they could have that chance of penalty. Whereas the reporters, have incentive to report biased within reason. And then we manipulate depletion. So we use an initial writing task. We use a depletion manipulation that's commonly used in psychology. And we kind of follow it exactly, which is important because there's been some concerns about replication crisis in depletion in some of the experiments. And I think a lot of that, a lot of those issues were stemming from one of the replication studies was not necessarily replicating the depletion manipulation appropriately. So we make sure we do a lot of work to make sure that we are really manipulating self-regulatory depletion. And so we use this initial writing task. We ask all students, managers, and auditors in this study to write about a recent trip. And in the non-depleting condition, they're told, and this is a 6-minute task, they're told not to use any words with a Q or a Z. And so that's not too difficult because there's not that many words with a Q or a Z. But in the depleting condition, they're told not to use any words in their story with an A or an N. And so that is really difficult. And there's a kind of a constant, you're trying to override those natural impulses to use those words with A or N. And so it involves a lot of self-regulation, kind of overriding those natural impulses. And so you can see here this example from oh, you know what? This is a mistake here. This is the non-depleting example. My slide here on the bottom is wrong. You can see that they were easily able to kind of write a long paragraph here in their 6 minutes. And then we get to the depleting example where they can't use words with the letters A and N. And I think you can see just by this that this is very difficult for them. So they didn't write very much. It looks like they got pretty frustrated with the cross outs, the scratch outs. I was in the room when they did these tests and I could just feel kind of, the frustration that they experienced. So this should be the depleting example. There's a typo there. And so importantly, we really make sure that we did manipulate depletion in our experiment. Our measures in the post-experimental questionnaire, we asked, how difficult did you find the writing task? It was much, much more difficult in the depletion condition. It was also perceived as much more cognitively demanding. We also had measured like how they felt fatigue in the post-experimental questionnaire when they came into the study versus when they left the study. And there was a stronger change in those fatigue measures in the depletion condition. So they perceive themselves as experience more fatigue in the depletion condition. They obviously wrote much fewer words. They had more scratch outs. Like those are evidence of frustration. So all this kind of maps into the construct of self-regulatory depletion in the psychology literature. And then later, when we get to it, we thought it was important to kind of, this is an abstract task with students acting as auditors. And so we did a lot of work in our qualitative data, talking to auditors to understand, like, what does depletion look like in the real world? How does it manifest? Like, what are your triggers of depletion? So we'll talk about that in a little bit. How's our chat? I'm seeing a few things. Feel free to just unmute and ask as well. Anything else? Okay. And then we measure the skeptical disposition. So we use the Hertz scale, which measures trait skepticism. It's a 30-point scale that's been used and validated in prior literature. We use it as a continuous measure in our model. So that's a good test of the hypotheses. We separate it as a binary measure just for visuals. We do find that the skeptical scores in our study are similar to those with auditors, and we make sure that the depletion manipulation didn't influence those skeptical scores, and we find that it did not. We use the full measure. It's similar if we just use those 3 dimensions of the trait skepticism, which we think are most critical for negotiations. And then our dependent measure and our model, our dependent measure is called challenge managers. So this is measured as managers' initial proposed asset value, what they first proposed to the auditor for their asset value, minus the final agreed upon amount. So how much they negotiated managers down from that initial estimate, which is very biased. So managers had incentive in the study to aggressively report their asset values, and they definitely did. So in all conditions, managers' initial values at least were quite biased. And that's kind of consistent with the prior research where managers are kind of knowing there's going to be back and forth negotiations, they start high, knowing that they're going to kind of concede and come down to some agreed upon amount. So on average, they were about 314 points over what their best private information was. And so challenging managers' biased estimates is really important dependent measure. We use a mixed effects regression model to test the effect of the interaction with depletion and skeptic. This is nice because it controls for those repeated measures. We have 10, repeated periods where they're randomly reassigned managers and auditors. And it also controls for the unique random effect from each individual participant. So it controls for that individual specific noise from each person. So we have 977 observations in this repeated measures model. We don't include the instances where they ended in an impasse because that, they didn't come to agreement. And we look at those kind of separately. So what do we find? I know I showed this in the beginning, but we can talk through it a little bit more here. So the results on the extent that the auditors challenge managers' biased reporting. So you can see here that, again, we have a significant interaction between depletion and the skeptical disposition and how they negotiate. In the non-depleting condition, there's no difference between the client service and skeptic auditor. And so that's consistent with our theory. Again, we think that they will have they're willing to engage in the effort to do the behaviors that they find difficult to balance their incentives during the negotiations. And then we see when depleted, these client service auditors, they challenge less. So that's consistent with them finding those challenging behaviors effortful and kind of leaning more toward their natural dispositions of pragmatic behaviors, coming to closure, client considerations like less challenging. And then for skeptic auditors, we find that they increase the extent to which they challenge when they're depleted. And that, again, is consistent with the theory that they're willing to engage in those pragmatic behaviors when they're not depleted, when they have kind of the effort. but they tilt more toward their natural challenging behaviors when depleted. And we find that, because we're using a continuous measure, but we find that these slopes are they both reach significant, at a certain skeptical score. So our mean was 133, so it's not too far away from the mean skeptical score. Any questions there? And then, this is obviously a significant difference. So under depleting conditions, which we think is the current environment for negotiations, there's a significant difference in how much auditors are willing to challenge managers' bias when depleted. So the high skeptics challenge to a greater extent than the client service kind of low skeptic auditors. And then, we're really looking at how auditors' kind of negotiation behaviors are influenced, and looking for evidence of this kind of challenging managers' bias. And so we have a couple of other additional measures that we can use to kind of get at this same construct. Several of these are from prior research from the Church et al. Paper. So the first one that we look at, we find consistent results in all four of these additional measures. The depletion by skeptic interaction is significant. So the first is their auditors' challenging counteroffer. So we find a consistent pattern with this dependent measure is the auditor's initial counteroffer, like how large that initial counteroffer is to managers. And then their likelihood of impasse. So the likelihood of, not reaching negotiation. These are small instances. They're not that many, but these are kind of a big deal. So being willing to go all the way to not reaching agreement and all receiving, zero amount of pay for that period, and in the real world too, like not issuing those financial statements if you can't come to agreement. These are, kind of infrequent, but big deal events. And so we find that those skeptic auditors are much more likely to reach impasse when they're depleted. And then round count, like how many rounds they're willing to go. So kind of, pushing on those negotiations. Again, we find the interaction. It's these skeptical auditors. They're going to, do that more when they're depleted. I think this is actually a better measure of kind of the per round count, like how challenging they are per round. This is more of like a efficiency effectiveness measure. And so we find the similar pattern. And I should say that, in terms of whether or not these slopes are significant at a certain level of the skeptic auditor and a certain level of the client service auditor, all of those kind of reach significance at some point. All right. And then we do some additional analysis on other auditor dispositions. There's been some recent prior literature looking at auditor traits, auditor dispositions, and even specifically within the negotiation setting. So one that's been used is the dark triad. Dark triad includes these three different narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy. Together kind of shares this common core of self-interested behavior. And so the Hobson et al. Study shows that these dark triad auditors, those who are higher on these dark triad traits, they're less trusting of managers, kind of in a one-shot interaction. And the Church et al. Paper finds that higher narcissist auditors are more challenging in negotiations. And that paper is really kind of unique to ours. Again, we adapted our study. In their study, the manager doesn't have private information. And so they just have really strong incentives to challenge. The auditors also don't have any cost of per round. So they didn't really have those balanced incentives to also care about the pragmatic considerations, the client considerations to reach closure. So it's a little bit different. Definitely like the challenging incentives are much more salient. So in that setting, the narcissist auditors were more challenging than less narcissist auditors. And when we sat down and thought about the dark triad personalities and what would make most sense for our theory and our negotiation setting where they do have to balance incentives, it seems to be that the Machiavellianism is most important, because in the negotiation setting we're looking at, you really do need to kind of balance these two incentives, the challenging incentives and the pragmatic incentives. And the Mach characteristic, they're more rational and they are like strategic by nature. So they're very calculated. They also have high impulse control. But again, they have those self-interested characteristics. So they are callous, cynical, they lack empathy. So they have, they're going to be strategic, but they also kind of are naturally challenging. And so we didn't find any, this is kind of ex post exploratory analysis. We didn't find any significant interaction with the narcissism and depletion or the psychopathy and depletion, but we do with the Machiavellianism and depletion. And so the findings are consistent with the theory that we have for the skeptical dispositions. So there's a significant interaction on challenging managers, and it looks the same as our skeptic versus client service pattern. So depletion decreases the challenging behaviors for the low Machs, and it increases for the high Machs. So that's kind of consistent with our theory for our original study. And then again, we collected some supplemental qualitative data to really help provide support and insights for our original kind of abstract experiment. So we did two things. We first did interviews with, these are rich interviews with 11 audit partners. They took on average about 40 to 60 minutes. And then we also collected some data with some audit managers and partners in Canada. Our first objective was to really get at what does depletion look like in the real world? Sorry, let me check this chat. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, very good question, Caitlin. So let me go back to the Mach. Oops. I think this is interesting too. How much do they overlap, right? So they are very unique constructs, but there is some overlap. Like they have an overlap on, especially the callous or the being cynical, right, Tracy? And so we see, so conceptually, we think there's some overlap, but not entirely. And then in the data, we do find that they are correlated. So there's a significant correlation. I want to say the correlated value is like 0.2 something. So it's not like incredibly strong, but it is a significant correlation. Yeah. But when we put both of these in the model, so we run a model with both the skeptic interaction with depletion and the Mach interaction with depletion. So putting both traits into our model, they're both significant. So they are capturing different things. And so it's really cool that we see that both of them support our predictions, even when they're in the same model. Does that help? Okay. So the qualitative data was really fun. We don't have really any research right now in auditing in depletion that is rich and kind of looks like, what does real auditing look like in the real world? So it's really fun to talk to partners and get a good understanding of, is depletion real? What causes you to have depletion? Tell us how you think it would influence these types of partners. So that was the interviews. And the other objective of both of these was to kind of validate the realism of our skeptic versus client service auditor personalities. Again, we worked with the literature and practice to kind of create those descriptions of we know what the high skeptics are, but really to get a good understanding of the low skeptics, the client service partners. And so we validate that with the Canadian audit managers and partners. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay. Sorry, just keeping up on the chat too. So first, our evidence from the interviewed, actually, let's just say interviewed partners. We asked them, like after describing depletion, like what what triggers of depletion, do you think about in auditing? And so consistent with kind of our expectations, consistent with psychology, 91% of them stress this constant, like complex and focused thinking. That cognitive thinking, that complex thinking is really depleting. You can think of it as being, mentally fatigued. And I think we probably all experience that after a long day or a long week of hard work, like we just are kind of cognitively tired. Pressures and deadlines, that's another big trigger of depletion. So when they're having just these intense deadlines, accounting issues popping up, they have a lot of risk and responsibility, all of that pressure, they can feel it, that leads to depletion for them. Balancing these multiple priorities came up a lot. So not only multiple clients, but multiple sources of accountability, multiple client issues popping up at the same time. And these are things that happen in busy season. So this kind of goes back to our assumption that auditors are probably, quite depleted during those busy times when the year-end negotiations are occurring. And a new one was the pandemic factors. So all these back-to-back Zoom calls, the auditors felt like really added to their depletion triggers. We did also ask the managers and partners from the Canadian pool about this, but there we had them just describe one instance of when they were depleted, like in detail. And so all of their or most of their items capture these things. It's just they're not going to touch on every single one because they were doing like a very descriptive one situation where they were really depleted. The audit partners in the interviews also did feel that depletion accumulates during these busy seasons. So some of them, I think it was like 60% even said that they feel like they start the day depleted during these busy times. But they almost all said that like there can be periods of refreshment. So there's variation, and they do feel like they can kind of get a second wind going into some situation, or sometimes like the adrenaline can kind of get them through. So even when they're depleting, they can experience these periods of some refreshment. And we also asked them about like how they manage depletion. So many of them talked about exercise, things that are personally important to them, breaks, fresh air, things you would think of, help from others, and kind of other strategies. So I think this data is super interesting. It does help a lot in just getting kind of that rich data from real auditors on what depletion looks like to them in the real world. And then another piece of our qualitative data was to get at these insights on the skeptic versus client service auditors. Again, we developed kind of what we thought was high skeptics, and then what are these low skeptics? So these client service auditors descriptions. So after talking with a few audit partners and kind of scouring the literature and thinking carefully about what these constructs are, we came up with these partner A, the client service type, and the partner B, the skeptic type. And so you can see here, how these work. So I think we kind of know what the skeptic is. On the other side, the client skeptic, that they naturally tend to be receptive to the client's assertion. They want a balanced information search. They're not going to like scour everything. They're not going to go into that no stone left unturned. They're very aware of efficiency costs. And they tend to be ready to understand the client's perspective. And they generally do want to achieve like efficient closure on issues. And so they're very pragmatic, I think is a good word. And that's a word that some of the audit partners used. So when we did the interviews, we gave the partners these two types of audit partners. And the interviewed partners, they readily had partners come to mind that they thought were type A or type B. We didn't necessarily call them skeptics and client service. We just gave them type A, type B. And so they had people come to mind that were like, definitely this type, definitely that type. But they also stress that both qualities are important, that they do need to balance these two qualities in auditing. And so then when we ask them, like for type A or type B, if they are depleted, what do you think would happen during negotiations? And so 64% of those partners that we interviewed said that they thought that they gave some sort of response consistent with our theory that the depleted client service auditors would maybe negotiate less challengingly, more pragmatically. So you can see a couple of these quotes here. If they're depleted, I can see, just wanting to wrap it up, or, leaning more toward efficiency. Let's keep the client happy. Just trying to get it done so we can move on. So they kind of had comments consistent with our theory there. And then likewise, 73% suggested those partners that match our depletion, our skeptics, when they're depleted, they had responses that kind of also mirrored our theory, that they're going to challenge more and be less pragmatic. So maybe being depleted will lead to more and more questions rather than getting to the right answer. Could take them down a rabbit hole. They'll prolong forever, wind up in knots before we reach a final judgment. So showing like that depletion will probably influence them. Sorry, just looking at the chat here. Yi, did you get your question answered or anything else? Okay. Yeah, feel free to ask. I'm happy to have it be more conversational if you have more questions. Okay. And then we took those descriptions of the skeptic and client service partners, and we validated that they do match with the trait skepticism scale that we gave to our participants. So we had the 41 auditors, the managers and partners, like look at those descriptions, and the question we asked them is, considering your most natural disposition, where do you fall in the continuum from partner A to partner B, using a 10-point scale. And so we find that the auditor scores are positively correlated with the Hertz skeptic scores. So that kind of provides some validity to the measure we use in our experiment, to the real world. And so we think like auditors could, you could use that scale rather than the 30-point Hertz scale to kind of get at individual auditors' natural dispositions for skeptic versus client service kind of types. So any questions on those qualitative results? We have a million quotes. We have a lot more in the paper. So if you're interested, I will be kind of posting a new version of the paper to SSRN probably soon. Oh, your mic is not working. Okay. I'm just reading through this comment here. Okay. So for, conclusions, like our main finding is that these effects of depletion on auditors, it really depends on their natural disposition and how effortful the task is for them. We find that skeptics challenge more and are less pragmatic when they're depleted, whereas the client service auditors, they challenge less and they are more pragmatic when they are depleted. And so we think this contributes to a lot of different literatures in auditing. Like, of course, in negotiations, there's negotiation literature that looks at individual attributes and situational effects. So it touches on both of those. So we're identifying trait skepticism as another factor that influences these important auditor negotiations. And also the situation, like how depleted they are. And right now we think like during negotiations, most people are depleted. So it is interesting and important finding that we see under the depletion that there's a significant difference between these client service and skeptical types. We contribute a lot to the auditor depletion literature. So far, the depletion literature is really focused on when auditors are depleted, that it can lead to, harmful effects on audit quality. And so it's interesting here to show that it does depend on the natural disposition. Like they're not always going to maybe do worse. Like for the skeptic auditors, if they are more challenging in negotiations, like that may not always be good. But if it's a really aggressive client, then that would be good for audit quality. It would be an audit quality enhancing effect of depletion. It adds to the literature on the partner workload pressures. So there's some kind of emerging research looking at workload pressures. There's a archival study that shows that under high workload, the audit partners, what is the, Tracy, help me out here. What, the Hardy study?
Oh, yeah. So that was a really neat study. They found that the highly skeptical partners, when they were under the high workload, they were more prone to issue a going concern opinion. So their findings kind of reflected ours in an archival setting. So we were really excited about the complementary nature of that.
Yeah, I forgot that they had the trait skeptic score. So I'm like, how did they get that? But yeah, they did, which that's
through a survey. It was really cool. Yeah, with I think Belgian auditors, maybe. They have a series of really neat papers.
So that paper provides like some, more additional external validity to our theory, and then our paper provides really strong causal effects of depletion for these different auditor types. So that's exciting. We add to the trait skepticism literature. I think the types that we bring up are really valuable. Like we didn't really know what the low trait skeptics are. And I think it's really important to realize they're not bad auditors. They're not just low trait skeptic. They're more like client service auditors. Like they're pragmatic, and they also add a lot of value to auditor have these competing goals. Let's see, I want to talk more about implications for practice, because I think we have some really interesting implications here. And so first, negotiations involve managers, right? So during negotiations, like having these depleted skeptics can be beneficial for audit quality, particularly if the client is very aggressive. And it may be potentially problematic for lower risk clients. So these types matter. And vice versa for client service auditors. Like if client service auditors are depleted and going up against some aggressive managers, that could be a problem for audit quality. So firms can really, we think, build this into their quality control mechanisms and procedures. There's been a big push just recently by the PCAOB looking at the quality control procedures of firms. And so we think and I think the audit partners that we talked to were pretty receptive to this. Like they do agree that we can identify this disposition and develop habits and strategies to kind of offset these effects. So they can have, if they can identify what types auditors lean toward, they can build in some mechanisms to kind of guard against these depletion effects during negotiations. So they can develop strategies or help develop habits for dealing with the depletion effects. There's really a lot they can do too with involving another partner, like especially if they know that they're going to be going into a really challenging situation during negotiations with a manager that's known for being high aggressive, or they know that management is has some aggressive estimates that they're worried about. Like they could bring in another partner, maybe the relationship partner or national office consultation, maybe pair them with somebody who is the skeptic type, especially if they're more client service leaning. And our study really adds to like these recent regulator concerns that pressures in the audit environment can impair auditors' professional skepticism. So that's something that the regulator is really worried about. And our study adds to that because, I think especially if they're client service type, these pressures from depletion in the negotiation setting, it can impair their ability to engage in those skeptical actions if they're not that type. And so I think we add to those regulator concerns and provide some nuance to it that it's probably a certain type. I also thought it was interesting that when we asked the partners, like which one they lean toward, these are audit partners, high-level managers, and it wasn't 50-50, but it was pretty close. Like many of them were client service type partners. And so, they're not all like the highest skeptical. So there is variation at those top levels of which type they are. And I just think in general, our study provides a lot for audit practice to realize that the incentives that audit firms put in place, these quality controls that they put in place to incentivize certain behavior, that's going to be less effective when auditors are depleted. And I think they're depleted, a lot. And so understanding that is important, knowing that when individuals are depleted, those incentives may be less effective, especially if that motivated behavior is effortful. And I think like situations where incentives are put in place, it's because those behaviors are effortful. And so just realizing that, and that kind of generalizes, I think, to any setting, that your incentives are probably going to be less effective when individuals are depleted. And so any other questions? That's kind of what I had for our presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions and talk about anything else that you all have.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Laura, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation and excellent paper. Thank you very much. Now, if anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Angie, you have any question?
Yeah, Angie.
Yes, hello, Professor Lori. Very interesting publication and the research. And I was gonna ask a question about, because I'm more of an empirical person, so I was gonna ask about how it is in the empirical literature. I'm glad that you mentioned the research that was related to the going concern.
Yeah.
But I want to talk to you about your research regarding if you had looked at gender as a factor, whether female auditors were less depleted than male auditors. I don't know. I don't know if that would be. Did you find anything interesting on or not? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to say we did look for a gender effect in our experimental data and did not find anything, especially no interactions. I don't know if we have enough data or if we've looked at the qualitative data, but we did not see anything major. Correct me if I'm wrong, Adam or Tracy, but I know we looked at gender in the main experiment and didn't see any effect worth noting. Definitely no interactions. So, yeah. Jason?
Great presentation and great paper, Laurie, Tracy, and Adam. I had read it a while back, but it was good to kind of hear it again. And it brought back something, I brought up something in my mind, just thinking about the firms. A lot of the firms have been having a lot of new initiatives to kind of help retain the workforce and giving days off or, all types of things to help retention. And I think, your findings can speak to that and say they also need to go a little further, because not only is it a retention issue, but it can be a quality issue as well. And so they can kind of enhance these initiatives that they already have and have a twofold effect. Not only does it help retention, but the people who actually do stay will give a much higher quality work product if they kind of consider depletion or ways to mitigate this depletion. So I think it's a very relevant study and very, very interesting results.
Cool. Thank you, Jason. That's a great point. Yeah, I totally agree.
Is there another question? If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question.
I'm seeing in the chat a question about is it possible to study the size of the firm as a variable to classify the auditors in research? I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
If anyone have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Thank you very much, dear Professor Laura, for your contribution and your effort. It's been really appreciated. Thank you, everyone, joining us today, and thank you for taking the time to present to us, the dear Professor Laura. It's been really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful. And thank you all for attending today. It was great to share with you all.
Yeah, and I hope to see you soon in Egypt. You are very, very welcome.
Okay, thank you so much.